to throw away. I want you to ask one question about each item. Does this need to be within arm's reach while I am actively sewing? Being there during a sewing session. Okay, so we have cleared your table and we have created dedicated homes for your notions. On the fabric itself, or on a folded note card tucked into the fold of the fabric, with two pieces of lawn in under 30 seconds. That is not a tip I saw in a book. That is something I discovered by being a resourceful scrapper and paying attention to how different fiber types behave. Which brings me to something I want you to keep in the back of your mind. For when we get to thing 4, fiber behavior is everything. The way a fiber reacts to heat, to steam, to tension, to completely change how your seams look. And it requires you to know the difference between how 100% cotton behaves under. I've been sewing for a while because it involves getting rid of something you probably think you need more of. Thread. From finished projects, threads bought on sale in colors that seemed useful, thread that came in a value pack of the olive green or the mustard yellow. If this is you, I am not judging you. I have been you. They were taking up space, creating visual noise, and making it harder to find the thread I actually needed. Here is what I want you to do. Pull out every thread spool you own. Lay them on a flat surface. Now sort them into two piles. Pile 1 is thread you have used within the last 12 months, or that you have a specific upcoming project for. Pile 2 is everything else. Take pile 2 and put it in a bag. Do not throw it away yet. I will tell you what to do with it in a moment. But get it off your workspace. What you are left with in pile 1 is your active thread inventory. This is what lives on your thread rack or in your thread storage. Everything else is archived or rehomed. Now, within your active thread inventory, I want you to think about building what I call a neutral core. For the vast majority of home sewing projects, you need 5 thread colors consistently. White or off-white, black, a warm medium gray, a navy, and a beige or tan. Those 5 cover probably 80% of your sewing needs for garment construction, quilting, and general home deck projects. Because in most cases, your thread does not need to perfectly match your fabric. It needs to be invisible in the seam, which means it needs to be close in value, not necessarily identical in hue. Beyond the neutral core, you add project-specific thread as you need it for specific projects. That is it. That is a manageable thread system that will not eat your table space, will not confuse you when you are sitting down to sew, and will not cost you anything beyond what you are already spending. Now that bag of archived thread, here is what you do with it. Check each spool for 2 things. Is the thread still strong, and is there enough left on the spool to be useful? You test thread strength by pulling a 12-inch length off the spool and giving it a sharp snap. Good thread holds. Old, degraded thread, especially cheap polyester that has been sitting for years, breaks under that snap or shreds into tiny fibers. Any spool that fails the snap test goes in the trash. Any spool that passes but is a color or type you will not use goes to a local theater group, a school art room, a community center sewing circle. Thread is one of those donations that small community groups are always grateful for. The spools that are good thread in useful colors but you just have too many of, those go into a secondary storage bin that lives in a closet or under a bed, not on your active workspace. Labeled, of course. Always labeled. All right, we have cleared and organized your workstation. We have built a scrap intelligence system that turns your fabric waste into a working inventory. And we have stripped your thread collection down to a lean, functional core. Those 3 things alone are going to change the way your space feels every time you walk into it. But I promised you that thing 4 is the one most people skip, and I meant it. This is the tip that the organizing videos and the sewing room tour channels almost never talk about, because it is not photogenic. It does not make for a beautiful before and after shot, but it will save you more actual sewing time than any storage solution you will ever buy. Thing 4 is building a physical tension reference system. Stay with me here, because I know tension sounds like a technical rabbit hole and not a setup tip, but I want to reframe the way you think about this. Your sewing machine tension settings are the single biggest variable between a session that flows smoothly and a session where you spend 40 minutes pulling thread nests out of the back of your fabric and rethreading your machine 3 times trying to figure out what went wrong. Most home sewers approach tension as a mystery they solve reactively, meaning something goes wrong. They fiddle with the dial, they sew a few test stitches, they fiddle again. That reactive approach is what turns a 2-hour sewing session into a 4-hour frustration spiral. What I want you to build instead is a proactive reference system, a physical record of what settings work, for what fabrics, with what thread and needle combinations on your specific machine. Here is exactly how you build it. Get a piece of cardstock. The back of a cereal box works perfectly. I have used it many times and cut it into a strip roughly 4 inches wide, and as long as your cardstock allows. Now, the next time you sit down to sew, before you start your actual project, sew a 3-inch test seam on a folded scrap of the fabric you are using. Check the tension on both sides. When it looks right, when the stitches are even, the thread is locking in the middle of the fabric layers, there is no looping on either face. Write directly on your cardstock strip what settings you are using. The needle size, the thread type and weight, the fabric type, the stitch length, the tension dial number. Then fold that little test seam piece and staple or tape it right next to your notes on the cardstock. Do this every single time you start a new fabric and thread combination. Over the course of 3 to 4 months of regular sewing, you will have a complete physical reference card that is specific to your machine, your thread, and your most commonly used fabrics. Hang it on the wall beside your machine, or clip it to the side of your machine with a binder clip. I keep mine on a binder ring, so I can flip through the swatches like a tiny sample book. When I sit down to work with a mid-weight linen blend, I flip to my linen section, match the thread weight, and I am at the right tension setting in under 60 seconds. And here is the part that makes this especially powerful for small space sewers. Your tension reference card eliminates the need to keep large amounts of test fabric accessible on your table. Because you already know it works, you have the proof stapled right there on the card. That means less pre-sewing setup clutter on your work surface, less time lost to troubleshooting, and more time in actual productive stitching. The card costs you nothing to make, and it pays you back every single time you use it. Now I want to go a little deeper on this because understanding why tension goes wrong is what will make your reference card genuinely useful rather than just a list of numbers you copied down once and never questioned. Your sewing machine makes a stitch by interlocking 2 threads, the needle thread coming from the top and the bobbin thread coming from below. The point at which they lock together should be precisely in the middle of your fabric layers. When your upper tension is too tight, it pulls the bobbin thread up toward the top surface. When your upper tension is too loose, the needle thread gets dragged down and loops on the underside. Now, most sewers adjust the upper tension dial and call it a day, but here is something that gets overlooked constantly. Your bobbin tension is also a variable, and it changes based on how you wound your bobbin and how your bobbin case is set. A bobbin wound at inconsistent speed, which is what you get when you wind it by hand or at an uneven foot pedal pace, will have varying thread density around the core, which means the tension it delivers changes as it unspools. The fix is to always wind your bobbins at a consistent, moderate machine speed. Not slow, not fast. Consistent. This is one of those things I learned after years at the machine, when I noticed that 2 bobbins wound with identical thread on the same day gave me slightly different tension results, and the only variable was how evenly they had been wound. Once I standardized my winding speed, my tension consistency improved significantly without touching the tension dial at all. This is also why your tension reference card needs to note whether you are using a full bobbin or a partially used one. A near-empty bobbin delivers thread at a different resistance than a full bobbin. It is a small difference, but on fine fabrics like voile or silk charmeuse, it is enough to show. Note it on your card. The more granular your reference, the more useful it becomes. I also want to mention needles here because they are directly connected to your tension system, and they are one of the most underreplaced tools in the home sewing room. If you are using the same needle for more than 8 hours of sewing time, and by sewing time I mean actual stitching, not setup or pressing time, your needle is almost certainly dulled enough to be affecting your stitch quality. A dull needle does not pierce fabric cleanly. It pushes the fibers aside or snags them, which changes the resistance on your thread path, which throws your tension off in ways that no amount of dial adjustment will fully correct. The fix is to change your needle more often than you think you need to. A pack of Schmetz Universal needles costs around $4 for 5 needles. That is less than $1 a needle. Change your needle at the start of every major project or every 8 hours of actual sewing. Write it on a piece of masking tape on your machine. Last needle change, date. You will be genuinely surprised at the difference a fresh needle makes to your stitch quality, especially on any fabric with a tight weave or a slight sheen. Now, I promised you a pressing technique that is going to change how your seams look. And we are going to get to that right now as part of Thing 5, which is building a pressing station that works within your existing space rather than requiring its own separate table. Here is the brutal truth about pressing in a small sewing setup. Most of us treat the iron like a finishing tool, something we use at the end of a project to make things look nice. That is backwards. Pressing is a construction tool. It is how you set your seams, control your fabric, and make your pieces behave before you sew them together. A professionally finished seam is pressed before it is sewn, during the sewing process at every junction, and after it is completed. That is 3 press points per seam, not 1 at the end, 3 throughout. The difference in seam quality between 1 press and 3 presses is not subtle. It is the difference between a seam that lies flat and a seam that has a little ridge running along it that no amount of final pressing will fully remove. The obstacle in a small space is that your iron and ironing board are often in a different part of the room from your machine, and getting up to press every seam feels disruptive to your flow. The solution is to create a small pressing surface that lives right next to or on the corner of your sewing table. You do not need a full-size ironing board within arm's reach. You need a pressing surface that is roughly 12 by 18 inches. Here is how you make one for free or very close to free. Take a piece of plywood or MDF cut to that size. A hardware store will cut this for under $2, and some will cut scraps for free. Wrap it in 2 layers of cotton batting. Then cover it tightly with a piece of 100% cotton canvas or a folded cotton towel. Secure the backing with a staple gun or with large binder clips along the underside. You now have a firm, well-padded pressing surface that can sit on your table corner, on a small stool beside your machine, or on top of a low shelf unit. The key word in that construction is cotton. Cotton everywhere. Your batting should be cotton, not polyester. Your cover fabric should be cotton. Here is why that matters. Polyester batting and synthetic cover fabrics melt or scorch under the high steam heat you need to properly press cotton seams and linen seams. And more importantly, they do not absorb steam the way cotton does. When you press a cotton fabric seam over a cotton pressing surface with a steam iron, the steam penetrates the fibers relax and reshape, and when they cool they lock into the new position. That is how you get a seam that lies completely flat and stays flat through wearing and washing. I cannot tell you how many years I pressed over a synthetic cover before someone in a tailoring workshop finally told me why my seams always looked slightly amateur no matter how carefully I sewed them. That was the reason. It was the pressing surface, cotton cover always. Now, here is the specific pressing technique I mentioned earlier, and this is where fiber knowledge becomes directly practical. When you are pressing a seam in 100% cotton fabric, you press with full steam and moderate pressure, moving the iron slowly along the seam in the direction of the grain. You press the seam closed first, meaning you press it just as it came off the machine, both seam allowances together, to set the stitching and remove any puckers. Then you open the seam with your fingers, Finger press it flat and press it open with the iron, again moving with the grain. That two-step process sets a cotton seam better than pressing open in a single pass. Now do the same thing on a cotton polyester blend, and you have a problem. The polyester content in a blend does not respond to steam the way pure cotton does. It is more resistant to reshaping under heat. If you apply the same full steam high-heat press you use on 100% cotton to a 60/40 cotton poly blend, you can get a slight sheen on the fabric surface where the polyester fibers have responded to the heat in a way that changes their surface texture. It is called glazing, and it is very difficult to reverse. The fix is to reduce your steam slightly. Use a pressing cloth between the iron and the fabric. I use a piece of plain cotton muslin for this, and press with a lifting and lowering motion rather than a sliding motion. You are not gliding the iron along the seam. You are setting it down, applying brief pressure, lifting, moving slightly, setting down again. It takes about 15 seconds longer per seam. It protects the polyester content from glazing and still sets the seam properly. For linen, you go the opposite direction from poly blends. Linen loves aggressive steam. Linen that seems impossible to press flat, stiff, wrinkled, resistant, responds to a very high steam setting and a slightly damp pressing cloth laid over the fabric before you press. The moisture plus the steam essentially shocks the linen fibers into cooperating. I have taken linen that looked like it had been slept on for a week and gotten it completely flat and crisp in under 3 minutes. Using that technique, if you are avoiding linen because you think it is too difficult to work with, try this method before you give up on it. It is one of the most rewarding fabrics to sew once you understand how to handle it with heat. One more pressing note before we move to the close, and this one is specifically for quilters or anyone working with steam seam or any fusible web product. Read the instructions on your fusible product before you press every time, even if you have used it before. Fusible web products vary significantly in their heat and pressure requirements. Steam seam 2, for example, requires a dry iron, no steam, at a cotton setting with firm pressure, held for a full 10 seconds per section. If you press it with steam, the moisture can prevent the adhesive from bonding fully, and you end up with applique pieces that lift at the edges within a few washes. I have seen this happen to otherwise beautifully made quilts, and it is always because someone used steam when the product specified dry heat. The instructions are there. Use them. Even on products you have used 100 times, manufacturing batches vary and recommendations occasionally change. A 60-second check saves you a destroyed project. So let me bring all 5 things together for you, because I want to make sure you leave this video with a clear action plan rather than a list of things to think about someday. Thing 1, treat your sewing table as a workstation, not a storage surface. Clear everything that is not actively in use during a sewing session off that table. Put a magnetic strip on the wall and move your tools vertical. Thing 2, build a scrap intelligence system with 3 containers and masking tape tags that record fiber content and size. Your scraps are paid for material, and they deserve to be organized like it. Thing 3, reduce your thread to a neutral core of 5 essential colors, archive or rehome everything else, and stop letting thread volume create visual noise and physical clutter on your workspace. Thing 4, build a physical tension reference card specific to your machine, your thread, and your most used fabrics. This is the thing that will save you the most real time per session, and it costs you nothing but a piece of cardstock and 30 extra minutes the first time you do it. And thing 5, build or repurpose a small cotton-covered pressing surface that lives next to your machine and start treating pressing as a construction step rather than a finishing step. 3 press points per seam, cotton pressing surface, fiber-specific technique for cotton, poly blends, and linen. None of these 5 things require more space. Every single one of them makes the space you already have more powerful and more enjoyable to work in. And that is the point I want you to walk away with today. The sewers who produce consistent, high-quality work in small spaces are not doing it because they have a secret room somewhere or a budget that lets them buy every organizational product on the market. They are doing it because they have built systems that are specific, repeatable, and rooted in a deep understanding of the materials and tools they are working with. You now have those systems, all 5 of them, and they are yours starting right now with what you already have. I will see you in the next one.